Welcome to LearnHowToQuilt.com. In today's video, you'll learn how to add a mitered border to this corner square quilt. In the first video in this series, you saw how easy it was to add a simple border. Now you'll find out about mitered borders and review different methods for adding these to your quilt. First, I'll use paper to explain the process. Then I'll demonstrate using fabric. This video is a little longer than I'd like. Feel free to skip ahead. I'll leave the links to these topics below. Now come on in and let's get started. Simple borders are rectangular strips that are added to the sides of the quilt using straight seams. Using solid colored fabrics or non-directional prints will make a simple border look like it continues around the quilt with no breaks. Directional or border prints get broken up when used as simple borders, but they can also add another dimension of design to your quilt. Unlike a simple border that meets at a right angle, mitered borders meet in the corners at 45-degree angles. These strips are sewn together using a Y-seam. Quilters often use miters with directional or border prints. That miter allows this print to sort of flow around the edges. When adding these mitered borders, you want to make sure that you keep your quilt squared. So, like simple borders, you always start by measuring through the center. But with a mitered border, you're going to have to add some extra on either side to make up for this miter. Now, before we go any further, I've added a 1/4-inch seam allowance on either side of this strip to make it easier to visualize how this is going to work on a real quilt. So with miter borders, the first thing I do is I take my quilt top and I press it in half, and then I press it in half again. After I press that, then I press my border strips in half so that when I measure through the center here, I'm going to match up those centers and I'll have extra fabric on each side for those miters. You'll want to make a mark at the edge of your quilt and then move over 1/4 of an inch and make another mark there. I'll do the same on the other side. Where this 1/4 inch mark intersects this other 1/4 inch mark, that is the start of my miter. And my miter is going to go like this. And that miter has to be a 45-degree angle. I can use the 45-degree line on my rotary ruler and draw that in. Or I can use the 45-degree angle on my mat. So here's my 45-degree line. Line that dot up vertically and horizontally, making sure it's straight, and then I'll draw this line. So this is where the finished size of the miter is going to end up. But in order to cut this out, I need to add a 1/4 inch seam allowance to this. So I'll take my ruler again, and I'll add that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I've folded these seams in, and this is what it's going to look like when added to the quilt. This is extra here that can be cut off, but I usually like to leave just a little more fabric to give me some working room. So I'll make sure both sides are the same. Then I'll transfer these markings to another strip. Repeat this process for the other side. Fold your strip in half, make your marks, find the 45-degree angle, and then add a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now you'll see that there's not a whole lot of extra fabric here at the end. And generally speaking, if you fold your strip on the diagonal, you should have enough fabric to reach this edge here of the strip. So I've got a little bit extra here. And as I said earlier, I like a little extra just to give me some breathing room. Now I'm ready to add the borders to the quilt top. I'll start by pinning from dot to dot, like so. Once those pins are in place, I'll stitch from this dot to this dot, making sure to stay out of this space here. After this one's been added, I come across and I add this piece making sure just to sew from dot to dot. These edges should be free. I'm ready to add the next piece. You're going to pin from this dot all the way down to this dot and then stitch. After adding this side, then I come over and add this last strip. At this point, none of these ends here should be sewn, and none of your stitching should be past these dots. Your next step is to take these pieces and line them up. Now some folks like to pin this and then take it over to the sewing machine and stitch on that line. But actually what I like to do is pin that and then stitch it by hand just to make sure that everything lies flat. And I would do that in each corner all the way around. Now sometimes you'll get to a corner, let's see which one. Okay, let's look down here. Sometimes you'll get to a corner like this, and maybe there's extra room here and something's not right. That's why I like a little extra fabric, because depending on how this strip goes on or this strip goes on, sometimes these don't always meet at that 45-degree angle that I've got drawn in there, and you have to do a little bit of maneuvering, like maybe I have to take a little extra fabric out of this piece in order to get everything to lie flat. Your main goal is to make sure that this all lies flat and not to stitch anywhere near this dot here. So now we're ready to go to the real quilt. I like to draw up a rough sketch so I can figure out these border lengths and yardage. I'll be adding an 1.5 inch inner border and a 5.5 inch outer border. The cutting widths for these strips will be 2 inches and 6 inches. To find the lengths of these border strips, I added the unfinished sizes of the borders along with the quilt top. So for this border right here, I'd add 6 and 2 and 46 plus 2 plus 6. I end up with 62 inches. So for those vertical outer borders, I'll cut 2 strips at 6 inches by 62 inches or longer, because I feel that it's best to leave a little extra on the length because it gives you room to work with. For more information about figuring border sizes and the yardage requirement, check out this video. I'll leave the links below. Before you get started, make sure your quilt and border strips have been folded and pressed. Mark a dot 1/4 inch down and 1/4 inch over in each one of the 4 corners. There are a couple ways to add a double mitered border. One way is to add this inner border first and then add the outer border. Another method is to sew the inner border to the outer border first and then add these strip sets to the quilt. We'll look at this method first. Line up the border centers with the quilt center. Mark the edge of your quilt on the strips. Go over 1/4 inch and then down 1/4 inch to make your dot. Draw in the 45-degree angle and then the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Mark each end of both strips. Measure through the center with the vertical strips and then mark the edges. Then draw the 45-degree angle and add the 1/4 inch seam allowances. When all the strips have been marked, you're ready to pin. Now I've marked this strip on this darker side and on the lighter side. I'm actually going to use the lighter side as the right side of the fabric. Some people don't like to mark their strips on the right side because if it doesn't erase, it might show. I've got this marked on both sides so you can see what's going on. What's most important here are these dots, because you want to make sure that the dot's 1/4 inch from the edge in both directions, and you don't want to sew past that dot. I'm going to match those dots up, and I'll put this pin in. I'm going to go over to the center of this quilt. Here's the center of my strip in the center of the quilt. I'll pin that, and then I'll come to the end here, put my pin through this dot into this one, and pin. I'm doing the same thing to this section here. Now this fabric on the end here is extra. I could trim it off past this 1/4 inch seam here, but I prefer to have a little extra. I'll trim it later. This pin is going through the dot here. I want to make sure that I don't sew any stitches past that dot. I've got the pin here and my needle is going to be in front of that pin. Let me just double check. Yeah, so 1 to 2 stitches and then back stitch 1 to 2 stitches and then come forward. And sometimes you might stitch 1 too many back, so I'd like to just do this manually. Okay, that looks good. And I'll come forward. That way I'm locking my stitches at that dot. I'll continue stitching all the way to the end. Now I'm coming to the end here where the other dot is, so I want to sew right up to that dot, not go over that dot, and then backspace. Slow down. I'm going to hand crank this, and that's close enough, so I'm going to go back now. Let me pull that out. I'm using this darker thread so you can see. You'll want to use more neutral colored thread. That dot is right here. I could have sewn a couple more stitches in, but that's okay. It's better to be short a stitch or two than it is to be past that dot. This is what that section looks like. Here's the line where my 45-degree angle is, and if I fold this on that angle, you'll see that this is where the mitered corner is going to go. Repeat this process with the other 3 border strips, making sure that this fabric stays out of the way. So as I add the other strips, I'll fold this back to keep this area clear. So you're going to come in and pin that dot. You can't see it, but it's right in there. And I guess I didn't get the miter drawn on this side, but where that pin is where my dot is. Put this down, lower my needle just to make sure that I'm not going to hit that pin. I'll sew a few stitches forward and a few stitches backwards. I'm going to hand crank this last one. Okay, that looks good. And I'm ready to sew. Now here's what this corner looks like after I've sewn. There's my dot and there's my other dot, and I'm not matching that exactly, but that's okay because I'm going to maneuver this around. There's my other dot, and here's my 45-degree lines. In a perfect world, these strips would line up vertically like this, and this will be a perfect 45-degree angle. But you can see where I've drawn my lines and it's off a little, but I'm most concerned that this corner lies flat. So I have to get in here and erase these lines, and I'll pin this down because this is the way I want it to be sewn, and I'll hand stitch this in place for my perfect miter corner. To sew this by hand, I'm using a single-stranded thread that's been knotted at one end. You'll want to use a matching color thread. I'm using this darker one so you can see. I'll come up right where they meet. Just take a little notch of that fabric. And I'm going to do an applique stitch here. So I'm going to go down almost exactly where I came up. I'm going to scoot over just about 1/8 of an inch, and I've come up right on the edge of that fabric here, and I'm going to go down right alongside of that, and then I'm going to scoot over about 1/8 of an inch so you can barely see my stitch right there, and then I'll go down. I'll scoot over. See me picking that up, and then I'll go down, and I'll continue until I get to the end. Here's my completed corner, and I can go in here and trim out the excess. Repeat this process on the other 3 corners. Take the outer border and then match up the center of the strip to the quilt center. Mark the edge of your quilt on the strips. Go over 1/4 inch and then down 1/4 inch to make your dot. Mark the 45-degree angle and then 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you want to put right sides together, match up these midpoints To use a safety pin to make it kind of easy to find that spot. Come down to the edge here, and you want to match dots. Kind of hard to see where it is on here. So I'm 1/4 of an inch down and 1/4 of an inch over from the edge. Then I'll pin this section in here. I started at the dot, back stitched, and then sewed to the other dot, back stitched, and then pressed. Here's that miter. That's going to make a nice mitered corner. Next, I'll sew this outer border. Before pinning, I pulled this fabric over here to make sure it's out of the way, and then I matched the dot. That dot is on that mitered line right there. I'll take this over to the sewing machine, making sure to lock my stitches here and not stitch in this area. So I've stitched up to that dot, and then I pressed. I come in here and fold this back, and this is why I like to have a little extra. I line up these strips going this way, and I fold this down. You're going to have a nice flat miter here. Most of the time when I do this, my miter doesn't fall exactly on those pencil lines. That happens because of a number of things. One is I might not have marked that exactly on the 45-degree line. Another problem can be that where I didn't sew exactly quarter inch seams, and so on. But right now, the most important thing is to get these two strips right here to match on the sides. Then what I like to do is come in here and press that line. After it's been pressed, I'll pin and then stitch. Hand stitch this miter with matching thread, so it looks a little better than this one where the thread was a different color. So I want to show you what the other side looks like. This is where I stopped on the dot, and this is where I stopped and back stitched on the dot. And then here are my stitches from the front, and I'm going to go in and trim the excess off here. And here's that nice mitered corner. In this method, first you'll sew the border strips together, and then you'll attach those units to the quilt. I measured through the center and made my marks on this inner border. Then I matched the border centers and put right sides together and pinned. Before you sew, you want to make sure that this angle looks like this. You don't want it going in the opposite direction. Just sew a straight seam all the way down. The edges aren't going to match. After sewing, draw in the 45-degree line. I can use this 45-degree line on my mat, like so, or I can use that 45-degree line on my acrylic rulers, place it at the bottom of my strip. I can use another ruler here to make sure that that lines up with the top. I matched the center marks here and pinned. I came down to the end here, and I matched my dots and pinned. So I've sewn from dot to dot and then pressed back. And here's that mitered corner. I'll sew this next section on now. After stitching, I came in and I folded my fabric on that miter. But as I said earlier, I'm going to pay more attention to having these strips match here than I am with this miter being right on the drawn line. The other thing I need to match is where these points meet. If I fold it like this section is going to be off of this section. So I need to maneuver that a little in here. And this is why I like to hand stitch this than to stitch it on the sewing machine, because it makes it a little bit easier to get these sections to match. Once I get everything right where I want it, I can take the iron in and press that, and then I'll pin. Here's that sewn miter. Let's look at the other side. With this method, you have one big Y seam, as opposed to the first method where you put in one Y seam here and a second Y seam here. And here's my completed mitered border. Hope this tutorial was helpful. Now you're ready to try mitered corners on your next quilt. Thanks for visiting LearnHowToQuilt.com. Please share our videos with your friends.